Let's talk about something raw, something real, something that no one talks about but so many of us feel. The one thing that triggers instant regret in an avoidant is losing someone who made them feel seen. I'm talking about the kind of person who was patient, who stayed, who loved them anyway, and they walked away because it felt too much, too intense, too risky. They didn't know how to receive it, so they pushed it away, convinced they'd be fine without it, that they were better off alone. But here's the catch: they weren't ready for the silence that followed. They weren't ready for the day you didn't call back. They weren't ready for the moment you stopped showing up for them like you always did. That's when it hits, because avoidants aren't emotionless, they're just scared. Scared of needing you, scared of depending on someone, scared of vulnerability. But when the person who accepted them disappears, they feel it like a punch to the gut. The regret? It's not just about losing you. It's about losing their chance at something real. It's about realizing, too late, that you were home and they locked the door on you. They chose comfort over connection, safety over soul, and regret shows up in quiet moments: the song on the radio, the empty side of the bed, the memory of your laugh. That's when the armor cracks. That's when they realize that distance didn't protect them, it imprisoned them. So here's the truth. The thing that triggers the deepest regret in someone with an avoidant heart isn't the fight, or the breakup, or even the silence. It's the day they realize they pushed away the one person who stayed when no one else would. Now listen, if you've ever been that person who tried, who showed up, who gave your best and still got shut out, don't question your worth. You weren't too much. You were the wake-up call they weren't ready for. And your absence, that's what finally made them feel, but their regret is not your responsibility. Your healing is. Avoidants don't fear love itself, they fear needing it, relying on it, and becoming vulnerable because of it. This fear stems from a deep-seated belief that emotional dependence is dangerous or a sign of weakness. For many avoidant individuals, the idea of being emotionally close to someone challenges their internal sense of control and safety. It feels like handing over the reins of their well-being to another person, which is incredibly uncomfortable for someone who has learned to rely only on themselves. This is why, even when someone comes into their life offering genuine care, patience, and emotional consistency, the avoidant often starts to pull away. Not because they don't care, but because they care more than they feel safe admitting. When someone consistently shows up for an avoidant, loving them through their emotional distance, their confusion, their hot and cold behavior, it pushes against everything they've built to survive. Their coping mechanism is withdrawal, but here you are, showing them that not everyone leaves, that not everyone demands more than they can give. And instead of receiving that love, their instinct is to reject it, to criticize it, to push it away, because if they let it in, it means risking hurt. It means confronting the fear that maybe they're not as self-contained as they believe, so they leave, or they create enough space to make you do it. They convince themselves they'll be fine, that solitude is easier, that emotions are messy, unnecessary distractions. But what they're not ready for is what happens afterward, the silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but hollow. The realization that the person who once made the world feel a little more manageable is no longer there. That safety net of emotional support is gone, and that's when regret creeps in, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The absence of someone who is patient and present becomes louder than any argument. It becomes something they can't shake. The quiet becomes a mirror reflecting back everything they ignored, the effort you put in, the loyalty you gave, and the love they couldn't accept. They start replaying conversations, moments when you offered kindness and they met you with coldness. They remember the look in your eyes when you were hurt and still chose to stay, and suddenly, the narrative they told themselves that they didn't need you begins to crumble. Avoidants don't experience regret in the immediate aftermath. They experience it in the stillness, in the contrast between what they had and what they're left with. The regret comes not from missing the relationship, but from realizing that they were seen deeply, fully, and they walked away from it. That's a hard truth to sit with, because in their world, needing someone was never the plan. But losing someone who made them feel safe, accepted, and loved unconditionally, that hits differently, and it always leaves a mark. The deepest regret for an avoidant doesn't erupt in the heat of an argument or during the emotional unraveling of a breakup. It arrives quietly, long after the door has been closed and the other person has stopped reaching out. In those early moments of separation, the avoidant might feel relief. They've returned to their comfort zone, the space where no one expects emotional vulnerability, no one demands closeness, and no one challenges the walls they've built. But that relief is fleeting, because over time, it is replaced by a silence that grows heavier, more uncomfortable, more revealing than they ever anticipated. Avoidants are often mistaken for people who don't care, but that's not the case. They feel deeply, they just suppress it. They push their emotions down, pack them away, and keep themselves distracted. But when the person who used to show up for them, the one who texted first, who checked in, who tried even when things got hard, suddenly disappears, it disrupts their illusion of control. There's no one left to respond to, no one to avoid, no one to test boundaries with. And in that emptiness, a realization begins to grow. They didn't just lose someone who cared, they lost someone who truly understood them. It doesn't happen overnight. The regret seeps in through small, seemingly insignificant moments. Waking up and not seeing a good morning message, wanting to share a random thought and remembering there's no one to receive it. Hearing a song that reminds them of a drive, a laugh, a look. These fragments of memory become reminders of what they had and pushed away. It's not loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers, but those whispers become harder to ignore. Avoidants often believe they're protecting themselves by keeping people at arm's length. They convince themselves that detachment is strength and independence is safety. But in losing someone who showed up consistently, who loved them through the distance and confusion, they start to see the cost of their emotional armor. That silence they thought they needed begins to feel like punishment. The quiet they once craved becomes a constant echo of everything they didn't say, didn't do, didn't allow themselves to feel. The real trigger isn't the loss itself, it's the finality of it. It's realizing that the door is now closed, and the person who once made them feel less alone no longer wants a seat at the table. That's when the regret truly hits. Not because they didn't love or care, but because they weren't ready to admit how much they did. And by the time they are, it's too late. The damage has been done. The other person has moved on, and they are left with the one thing they were trying to avoid all along, the pain of needing someone who's no longer there. Avoidants often grow up learning that vulnerability equals danger. Whether through inconsistent parenting, emotional neglect, or past relational trauma, they internalize the idea that closeness leads to pain, and that the safest way to love is from a distance. Over time, they become experts at building walls not to keep others out maliciously, but to protect their fragile sense of safety. Emotional distance becomes their armor, and they convince themselves that this is how they avoid being hurt. But what they don't realize is that emotional distance doesn't create security, it creates isolation. And when they finally lose someone who is willing to sit with them in their complexity, they begin to see the high cost of keeping their heart behind a barrier. At first, this distance feels safe, predictable, controllable. They operate from a mindset that says, if I don't get too close, I won't get hurt. They confuse emotional safety with avoidance of intimacy. To them, being too connected is risky. Relying on someone feels like surrendering control. But then someone comes along who doesn't just tolerate their walls, they gently challenge them. They offer patience, consistency, and acceptance. And the avoidant doesn't quite know what to do with it. Instead of leaning in, they often recoil. Instead of gratitude, they may show resistance. That resistance isn't because they don't care. It's because they're terrified of what it means to truly let someone in. Still, the other person continues to show up. They see through the avoidant's defenses. They don't run when the avoidant pulls away, they stay. Until one day, they don't. The person who tried to bridge the gap finally steps back. Maybe they got tired. Maybe they realized the love they were giving wasn't being received. Maybe they decided to choose themselves instead. Whatever the reason, they're gone. And that absence doesn't feel safe, it feels devastating. That's the moment when the avoidant begins to feel what they were so desperately trying to avoid. The realization that walls didn't protect them, they imprisoned them, is a painful awakening. The space they created to feel free now feels empty. The solitude they claimed as strength now feels like a mistake. They start to remember the comfort of being understood, the warmth of being accepted, and the security of someone who didn't try to fix them, but simply wanted to love them. In all those moments they brushed off, distanced themselves from, or dismissed come flooding back not as relief, but as regret. The worst part, they often realize it when it's too late, when the calls have stopped, when the texts go unanswered, when the person they pushed away has moved on, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That's when the avoidant begins to question everything, because for the first time, they see that their coping strategy didn't shield them from heartbreak, it created it. And that emotional distance, which once felt like protection, now feels like the reason they're alone. Loving someone with an avoidant attachment style can feel like loving a ghost, sometimes present, often distant, and always hard to reach. You try your best, you give your heart, you stay through their silence, their retreat, their emotional hesitation. You believe that if you just hold on a little longer, love a little harder, and show enough patience, they'll eventually let you in. But over time, something becomes clear. You can't love someone into emotional readiness. No matter how deeply you care, how much effort you pour in, or how clearly you show them they're safe with you, their healing has to be their own decision. And that's the hardest truth to accept. Being in a relationship with an avoidant often means carrying the emotional weight of two people. You end up doing all the work to keep the connection alive. You initiate the conversations, plan the time together, and offer reassurance without receiving much in return. And you excuse their distance by telling yourself they're just scared or that they've been through a lot. You try to be understanding. You justify the inconsistency, the emotional coldness, the lack of communication. But while compassion is noble, self-neglect is not. Eventually, you start to notice how drained you feel, how your needs go unmet, how you're slowly dimming your own light to accommodate someone else's shadows. And that's when you reach the tipping point, not out of bitterness but out of exhaustion, not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally started loving yourself. You realize that staying in a one-sided connection isn't loyalty, it's self-abandonment, and so you make the painful decision to let go. When you leave, it creates a ripple the avoidant didn't expect. They were used to your presence, even if they didn't fully engage with it. They relied on your consistency, even if they didn't express appreciation. And when that stability disappears, it shakes them. For the first time, they feel the impact of your absence, but that regret they feel, that realization they experience, that shift in awareness, it's not your job to wait around for it. It's not your burden to carry. The avoidant may begin to reflect on what they lost. They may regret not opening up, not meeting you halfway, not holding on to someone who gave them space to be themselves. But their regret isn't your responsibility to fix. You did your part, you showed up, you loved with honesty and vulnerability. And if that wasn't enough for them to meet you where you stood, that's not your failure, it's their unhealed wound. Your growth, your healing, your peace begins the moment you stop trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be saved and start choosing yourself instead. Because you deserve mutuality, you deserve effort, and you deserve a love that doesn't ask you to shrink in order to feel seen. Avoidants often don't register the weight of their decisions in the moment. They convince themselves that pulling away is the right thing, that staying distant is the safer choice, that cutting off emotional vulnerability is strength. When a breakup happens, or when someone walks away from them, they may initially seem unbothered, even cold. They tell themselves it was for the best. They rationalize the loss and return to the familiarity of emotional solitude. But what they don't expect is the wave of regret that comes not right away, but when the loss becomes undeniably permanent. Avoidants aren't immune to emotion. In fact, they feel deeply, they just have a long delay between experience and acknowledgement. In the aftermath of separation, they often focus on maintaining control. They avoid reflecting too deeply. They may distract themselves with work, routines, or surface-level connections. But eventually, there comes a moment where the silence becomes undeniable, when the calls don't come, when the messages stop, when birthdays pass unnoticed, when that person who once made space for them is no longer within reach. And that's when the regret begins to unfold. At first, it may feel like a restlessness, an itch they can't scratch. A sense that something is missing, but they can't quite define it. Then come the memories, vivid, unexpected, and emotionally charged. The sound of that person's laugh, the way they used to say their name, the comfort of knowing someone was there who truly got them. Those memories hit differently now. They aren't just nostalgia, they're reminders of something lost that may never return. That's when the avoidant starts to recognize not just the person they pushed away, but the depth of the connection they underestimated. The realization becomes more painful when they understand it's not temporary. The door isn't ajar anymore, it's closed. And the person they pushed away has started healing, has begun moving forward, and is no longer emotionally available to revisit the past. That finality is what flips the switch. They didn't just lose a partner. They lost the one person who saw them fully and still chose to stay. And once they see that, the regret cuts deep. They start to replay the choices they made, the conversations they shut down, the texts they ignored, the times they pulled away when they should have leaned in. The pattern that once made them feel powerful now feels like a trap. The emotional walls they thought were protecting them now feel like prison bars. And the most haunting part, they realize that their own fear created the very loneliness they were trying to avoid. That they had something rare, someone who genuinely cared, and they let it go, thinking they'd be better off. That thought stays with them. This kind of regret isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, lingering. It follows them through the spaces where love once lived. And by the time they fully understand what they lost, the damage is already done. In the end, the greatest regret for the avoidant isn't in the leaving, it's in realizing too late what they pushed away. A love that was patient, loyal, and real. But for those who tried, who gave wholeheartedly, and who finally chose themselves, that was your power, not your loss. Thank you for listening, for holding space for truth, and for reminding yourself that you were never too much, you were simply more than they were ready to receive.